When we rushed in and armed and equipped people that were jihadists in the very beginning, folks like Frank Gaffney and John Guandolo and others could tell you those are jihadists.
John Guandolo.
Okay, so I'm John Guandolo, former special agent in the FBI, combat Marine, and founder of Understanding the Threat. And my primary focus is briefing and training, and at this point, very much focused at the state and local level. Attorney generals, governors, state legislators, and specifically military and law enforcement. My only comment is, one, thank you for what this program is. And I think among those who understand the threat, I think it's extremely important to just stay focused on the fact that the threat is Sharia, and that it finds its authority in Islam. And there's no such thing as a version of Islam that doesn't rely on Sharia to drive it. And at least among those of us who are fighting this fight, the more we are actually very clear on that, the more ground we're going to gain, so that our allies, we don't give our allies any gray area about what this is. One of the things I teach law enforcement is, while that is the ideology, there are Muslims, I would never put a percentage to it, but there are some who do not subscribe to it. But we see through both practical realities. I mean, we have 80 to 85 or 90% of the Islamic centers, of which there are over 2,100 in all 50 states, are controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. So we know that Sharia is the driving doctrine. So to say that the vast majority are not subscribing to this, despite the fact that global polling shows that 70 to 95% do support Sharia, that's not reality. And I think if anyone's going to live in reality, it needs to be us. We need to be focused on the reality and the facts on the ground. And thank you, Frank, for putting this together today.
John, thank you.
In my initial remarks, let me say, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I very much appreciate the steady persistence that Frank Gaffney has shown over the years in trying to raise tough issues and defend America. And I think that the Center for Security Policy Press and their publication, which I will hold up as an ad here, that the Secure Freedom Strategy starts a really important, comprehensive conversation. Tiger team, until we obey Sun Tzu's injunction to know your enemy, we are hopelessly unable to make decisions. The president is about to send up an utterly, totally irrelevant proposal for the inadequate, constricted, and absurd misuse of force on behalf of a conflict he can't identify, an enemy he can't define, and a total misunderstanding of the war. And we need to start from a simple premise. We have been at war, I think, at a minimum since 1979. And I think you have to look at the Ayatollah seizing the embassy, which is what happened. I mean, anybody who believes students seized the American embassy in the middle of the Ayatollah's dictatorship and he wasn't aware of it or didn't tolerate it or didn't support it is literally out of touch with reality. And so we've been at war now for 35 and a half years. And we've learned nothing. If anything, we are less capable today of describing our enemies because they have managed to infiltrate our elites, they've managed to infiltrate our universities, they've managed to infiltrate our State Department, they've managed to infiltrate our think tanks, and increasingly the armed services. I mean, when you can describe Fort Hood as the Army did as a workplace incident, you are in very, very deep trouble. 2 days after 9/11 said, we should have a declaration of war. I think that's true. I think having the hearings to define what the declaration of war is about is central to the survival of the United States. Because it's not about ISIS, it's not about Al-Shabaab, it's not about AQM, it's not about Boko Haram. It is about a worldwide, religiously motivated, ideologically driven, totalitarian movement that is dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization, and as a part of that process is dedicated to the destruction of the United States. And we are at war with these people, whether we like it or not. We need to move to wartime legal circumstances where betraying America is an act of treason.
Thanks for inviting me here today. So Frank asked me, he said, Mike, I want you to give 5 minutes talking about the record to date in defeating radical Islamic terrorism. I told him I didn't need 5 minutes. That'd be a 30-second accounting to me. So we had a leader at Al-Azhar and then a leader at the prayer breakfast. And I want I want to give you a couple of things that were said, and you tell me which place you think they may have been said and by whom. One of the national leaders urged Muslim clerics to re-examine their religious teachings. He said it was not merely an extremist interpretation of Islam threatening the world, but rather ideas at the core of mainstream Orthodox understanding of that religion, and that a religious revolution would be required to change. He said that Islam, as is being taught and practiced by leading religious scholars, has given birth to a globally destructive ideology which is now threatening all of us. That, of course, was the Egyptian president, not our own. Our president had a very different view. He had a view of it as a series of random acts of violence, a series of disconnected dots along the continuum. And you've heard from others this morning what that means. It means a failed American response to the very real threat to us here in the United States from radical Islamic terrorism. What you see is a failure of understanding, a refusal to acknowledge the real threat and its connectedness. It is, more importantly, deeply dangerous. A commander-in-chief, a president, a nation that is unprepared to defend itself against the threat of the magnitude that the global jihadis present to us today is disturbing and dangerous. And I am so glad you held this conference, Frank, so that we can talk about it and identify it, begin to develop the solutions which will ultimately defeat them.
You know, we all say we have to identify the threat. Well, I think the one who identified it the best was Erdogan from Turkey, when he said, Islam is Islam. There are no modifiers. Democracy is the train we ride to our ultimate objective. He couldn't have said it any plainer. And until you recognize that Islam is a political movement masquerading as a religion, you're never going to come to grips with it.
Well, I think that the key thing to look at is that when we're fighting an enemy, he basically says that he fights according to Islamic law to implement Islamic law through jihad. And each of these terms is doctrinally defined in Sharia law. Almost all of it has a basis in the Quran and the Hadith. So that means that there is an imperative to understand if the enemy we're fighting says that he fights by those rules and you don't know those rules. I'm not talking about a one-off where you have someone write a book you buy in Barnes and Noble, then decide, gosh, that's good for me. I'm saying you actually read what they have said, and then you understand what they say in the context that they mean it.
I think any strategy has to begin with a national campaign that once again reinvigorates an understanding of our founding doctrine and our founding principles. The idea that our liberty, our rights come from God. No man or government can take them from us. And that's why everything that flows both in our legal system and our moral principles comes out of that there's a God who gives life, and therefore life is valuable. And we have to honor that. One of George Washington's parting gifts to us was this quote, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happy people than you are." And we shouldn't be afraid to talk like that, because it's you're imposing your Christianity. The founders never said you had to be anything, but they said there has to be, in a constitutional republic, a moral framework, and they said it was the Scripture. It's the Bible, sacred Scripture. And what we want to take out of that is that's worked. And that was taught since the time we landed at Jamestown and the time we landed at, have been here in this country, and we taught it. So I think until we get back to that and talk about the founding in the ideal of the Declaration, not just the Constitution, I think as it's been mentioned by several people, we're going to have a hard time, because we need to understand what are we defending. Because if it's not worth it, then defeating these guys doesn't necessarily make sense.